Star Trek: The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Number 3, Survival, Chapter 11. What did Mac want? Tanya asked.
Who knows?
Worf shook his head. Salida, however, had overheard the brief exchange between Worf and McHenry and now returned to Worf's side. I think something was wrong with him.
Of course something is wrong with him. He lives in a world of his own.
No, Worf, Salida said firmly. I detected a slight change in his voice. Also, and I would be the first to admit that Mark McHenry's mind does not move even in remotely logical fashion. Simply contacting us and then forgetting why he did so? That does sound a bit extreme, said Tanya, even for Mac. Worf looked from one of them to the other. The others had started to move ahead, but now Kayla returned to them. What is going on? She asked.
I am not sure, he said, but I believe I shall find out.
He tapped his communicator and said firmly,
Worf to McHenry.
Bond was hunched over the tricorder and communicator rig that Tanya had created. Mark's comm badge sat on the floor nearby. He heard Worf's voice come over it, but he was busy creating a specific series of code tones to be generated through the communicator. The Brickar had, in fact, known precisely what tones would be required to activate the entryway. He had not been about to share that information with the cadets, of course. He was also aware of other emergency backup signals to punch in, booby traps, and fail-safes to be used in times of duress. This was definitely one of those times. But here was Worf's voice again, and he didn't want to do anything that could tip the cadets before the trap was sprung. Well, he had bluffed his way through just before. He could easily do so again. After all, this was merely a Klingon. How difficult could it be to fool one of them? McHenry here, go ahead. Zach and Kodash ignored the discussion behind them and pressed on. They found a room where the door mechanism was not working properly and looked at each other for a moment. You interested in finding out what's in this room? Zach asked.
Of course.
Zach shoved his hands forward and managed to pry his rock-like fingertips into the crack. The moment he had it started, Kodash helped him pry it open. When Zach peered in, it was all he could do not to shout out loud.
This is it,
he whispered. Sure enough, it was. In contrast to the general rundown look of much of the facility, the communications board was state-of-the-art.
We found it, Kodash shouted. Kayla, we found it!
Then he heard Worf calling something back, something about trouble. That was when the rumbling started. Kodash and Zach looked at each other confused and stepped back. The door, no longer being held open by them, hissed shut.
What in Culker's name is that?
Said Zach uncertainly. Moments earlier, Worf was speaking into his comm badge.
Mac, are you all right?
Fine, came the terse reply. Worf glanced at the others for a moment, and then he said,
Mac, tell me about Peter Pan.
There was the briefest of hesitations. What?
Tell me about Peter Pan.
The comm badge went silent. Worf considered the possibilities and knew in an instant.
The Brickar is loose. We are in great danger.
Reflexively, he yanked out his phaser and shouted back over his shoulder.
Zach, Kodash, trouble, get moving.
And then the ground started to rumble. They looked at each other in confusion. What's happening? Demanded Tanya. They staggered as the rumbling became more pronounced. From up ahead, Zach and Kodash were heading toward them, tottering as they came. It was, naturally, Salida who heard it first. She said one word, the significance of which Worf did not immediately understand. The word was water. Bond set down the comm badge carefully and then stepped on it. He smiled as he ground it into tiny metal scraps. The Klingon had caught on. Bond grudgingly gave him credit for that. He had caught on, but it had come too late. The Brickar had managed to set the fail-safe into operation, and the gentle rumbling beneath his feet told him that, very shortly, The cadets and the Klingons were not going to be a problem any longer. Now they all heard it, a deafening roar. Worf pivoted to the left and then to the right, trying to figure out which way to go. His phaser was clutched tightly in his hand, but he wasn't sure which way to aim it or what to aim it at. And then it hit them. A tidal wave, a torrential, onrushing cascade of water barreled toward them from either end. They barely had a second to react, and it wasn't nearly enough. Before they could even move, the water had hit them. They were knocked off their feet by the initial impact, and in the next moment, they were swept upward. The impact was so violent that Worf's phaser was knocked out of his hand and washed away. The push of the wave shoved them in one direction, only to be met by the water coming the other way. It slammed them around helplessly. Within seconds, the corridors, with ceilings about 5 meters high, had been flooded. There was perhaps a meter of space at the top, which the water had not yet filled, but more was being pumped in by the second, and it wouldn't be long before there was no air left. They tread water desperately, but they weren't able to hold their position because the water was now carrying them along in one direction so quickly. It was like being caught in the speeding rapids of a river. They would be pulled under, then shoved back upward like a cork, to slam their heads against the ceiling before being dragged under once more. Worf thrashed about underwater, trying to gain some sort of handhold somewhere, anywhere. Doors hurtled past him with incomprehensible speed. He reached out, trying to grab one to slow himself down, and then he hit something. He wasn't sure what it was, but he reacted immediately, grabbing onto it as if it were a life preserver. It took him a moment to realize that what he'd hit was a body. Underwater as he was, he couldn't make out who it was, but whoever it was had managed to find an anchor on something. There was no way that Worf was going to risk dragging the person away from whatever safety had been found, but the anchored person seemed to be trying to encourage him to hang on. Using his unknown savior as a ladder, Worf pulled himself up inch by aching inch. The water hurtled past him, threatening to yank him loose, but Worf held on. He pulled his head above the waterline and found himself literally nose to nose with K'Ehleyr. "Hurry!" she grunted. Worf saw that she was clutching on with all her strength to an overhead pipe that probably served as some sort of energy conduit. He grabbed it with one hand, and then, when he was certain he had a firm grip, released her and clutched onto the conduit with both hands. The water was up to their chins and rising. "Any thoughts?" he asked. "Yes," she grunted. "If I had known we would be dying so soon, I think I would not have wasted the time we had together." He spit out some water, treading furiously to try and pull himself higher. "We are not going to die." "You're being optimistic." Worf looked around desperately. "No, I know what to do." "Grow gills?" "Right there." And he pointed. "That door there. Remember it?" "What door? It's underwater." "That weapons room is behind there. If I can get to it." "You're crazy. Even if you can." "Look," said Worf impatiently. "I can hang here and explain the whole plan and drown in the meantime. Or I can try and get us out of this. Now, do you want to complain or do you want to come along?" K'Ehleyr sank slightly and pulled herself back up. "Why not? I have nothing else planned for today."
"All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
On the count of 3, he dove under. K'Ehleyr followed, not really expecting to make it back up. Salida, Tanya, and Kodash splashed about furiously, trying to stay afloat. Zach was nowhere to be seen. The force of the water had slowed, but it was still rising. Salida started to sink, and Tanya saw that Salida was treading water only clumsily. Clearly, she was not an experienced swimmer, and immediately Tanya understood why. Vulcan was an arid, burning world. Swimming was simply not a major occupation on a planet with minimal moisture. She tried to shout Salida's name, but she swallowed water. The Vulcan went under, and Kodash, weighed down by his heavy leather armor, sank too. The push of the water almost shoved Worf right past the door he was trying to get to, but as he sailed past, his desperate fingers managed to snag the door frame. K'Ehleyr was pushed down toward him. Bracing himself with his feet and one arm, he reached out with the other and managed to grab her before she went past. Underwater, everything was silent. It was like being in the depths of space, except here they didn't have to worry about dying from explosive decompression, just drowning. Worf managed to indicate that Kalar should push the door open controls situated in the wall near her. It was only at that moment he bleakly realized that if there was some sort of override in effect, the door would not open. In that case, they would never make it back to the surface, because Worf's desperate lungs were running out of air. Kalar stretched her hand out, pushing against the flow of the water. Her fingers were inches short of the control pad. Worf gave her one additional shove, and her hand smacked against the pad. The door obediently opened. Worf, Kalar, and the water poured into the weapons room. It filled up within seconds, but for a brief second there was air. The two Klingons expelled what they had in their lungs and greedily sucked in more, a moment before being inundated once again. At the academy, the cadets had taken preliminary courses in weightless maneuvering, preparing for the possibility of being on a planet with lesser gravity than Earth's, or for the event of a ship's artificial gravity going out. Worf called those lessons to mind now. He angled himself around underwater. He placed his feet against one wall and then pushed off, shooting across the submerged weightlessness of his environment. He sailed across the room and locked his hands onto the heavy-duty rifle he'd been examining earlier. Even underwater, he could see Kalar's questioning look. What good is that going to do? It was asking. He wasn't exactly in a position to explain. He only hoped that his plan worked and that the others would survive long enough to benefit from it. Tanya was pushed higher and higher toward the ceiling as the water rose. Suddenly, her feet hit something. She couldn't tell what it was, and it didn't matter. It was something for her to stand on. She still had to fight the pull of the water with her arms, but at least she was able to brace herself. And then Salida bobbed to the surface on Tanya's right. A second later, Kodash came up on the left. The water was up to their chins, even though they angled their heads back to draw in what little air there was. How? Tanya managed to gasp out. Then she looked down. It meant submerging her head to get a better view, but she did it. She was able to make out a form beneath the water, a large humanoid form. She was standing on its head, and it was supporting the legs of the others with either arm. She recognized it immediately. Her head snapped back up, and she managed to cough out, "Zach! It's Zach!" Salida, still expelling water from her lungs, managed to nod. Kodash was shaking his head, and even above the noise of the water, Tanya could hear him mutter, "Saved by a breaker! I will never live this down!" Saved, however, was a wishful term. Clearly, Zach was able to hold his breath for considerable periods of time, which was fortunate since he wasn't exactly built for swimming. But Tanya knew he couldn't hold his breath forever, and with the way the water was rising, even his support wouldn't help for too much longer. With a scissor kick of his legs, Worf shot out into the corridor, holding the gun firmly. Kalar swam after him. She glanced up hopelessly, seeing the water rise closer to the ceiling, knowing that the end was near. And Worf was playing with guns. What was going through his mind? Worf was hovering over one of the gratings on the floor, aiming the gun toward it. That was when Kalar figured it out. Worf squeezed the trigger. A massive disruptor bolt ripped from the gun, straight down. Worf barely had time to be grateful that the weapon wasn't electrically based, since that might very well have electrified the water and fried both himself and Kalar. And then the force of the gun, due to the laws of action and reaction, shoved him upward with such force that he blasted out of the water and struck his head on the ceiling. But he had guessed correctly. The grating was, in fact, part of a drainage system. Under ordinary circumstances, the water would have remained in place for a sufficiently long time to drown intruders, and then the drains would automatically open and the water would be emptied into an underground conduit, probably siphoned back into the holding tanks that had released it in the first place. By blasting open one of the drain points, Worf had hurried the process along. Grasping an overhead pipe, Worf watched. At first, there was no sign of his having accomplished anything. But then the water below him started to swirl into a whirlpool. Kalar. Where was Kalar? For a moment, Worf had an image of Kalar being swept down into the underground water systems. He was about to release his grip and dive down after her when abruptly her hand emerged from the center of the whirlpool. She was fighting desperately against the pull of the water and was clearly losing. Within seconds, she'd be pulled back down again. She was beyond the reach of Worf's arm, but that wasn't going to stop him. He turned the rifle around and extended the butt toward her. Just before she was yanked under, she managed to grab onto it.
"Come on!"
Worf shouted. She brought her other hand up, clutching the rifle with full strength, and Worf dragged her toward him. His muscled arm twisted the rifle around, and her head broke the surface. She sputtered water for a moment, and then with a fierce kick of her legs drove herself upward, so that she now had a grip once more on the pipe that was supporting Worf. It's working," she managed to say.
"Perhaps we can speed matters along," he rumbled.
He shoved the disruptor underwater, angled it further up the corridor, and fired off several more shots. He hoped that his aim from memory was good enough to hit more of the gratings. It seemed that it was. Another whirlpool started to form, and the water level was now very visibly sinking. He twisted around, fired behind himself. A third whirlpool appeared. The tug of the water was fearsome, but they were solidly anchored on the overhead support. "He did it," she said.
"We did it,"
he replied, trying to sound modest. It did not suit him particularly well, though. Kalar studied him a moment, and then she moved her head forward and, to Worf's astonishment, kissed him firmly.
"What was that for?"
he asked. She actually smiled, showing teeth, as she replied, "For me." Tanya didn't quite understand what had happened. All she knew was that one moment she'd been fighting for the last bit of air, and the next moment the water level had dropped dramatically and was continuing to do so. Within minutes, she, Kodash, and Salida were able to clamber down off Zach. He was standing there smiling lopsidedly.
"That was pleasant," he said. "I can stay that way for a while longer if you wish."
"I do not think that will be necessary," Salida told him gravely. "Come on," said Tanya. "We've got to find Worf and Kalar. Make sure they're okay."
"They are both Klingon," Kodash said firmly. "That is more than enough to ensure survival."
"Although having someone to stand on apparently does not hurt," Zach pointed out.
Kodash wisely said nothing. Worf and Kalar waited until the water was only a foot or two deep, so low that they could clearly see the holes that Worf had blasted. When they finally released their grips, it was a bit of a drop. They landed with a splash, crouching like panthers. Their hair was sodden and matted down, their clothes soaked through. They were, however, alive.
"We have to get back up to the surface," said Worf. "Something obviously went wrong."
He shouldered the disruptor.
"But I think that we can handle it."
Bond didn't like what he was hearing. Far below, he had detected what sounded to him like some sort of weapons discharge, and then something else like water draining. No, he didn't like it at all.
"What are they doing down there?"
he snarled. Then he heard a low moan from across the room. Mark McHenry was starting to sit up, rubbing his head and trying to pull his scattered wits together.
"Your people have ruined everything,"
bellowed the Brickar. Mac, still a bit confused, couldn't think of anything to say. The Brickar advanced on him, his three-fingered hands curling into fists.
"If they manage to get back up here, all they're going to find is your bloody corpse."
There was a slight noise behind him. He started to turn, and then McHenry managed to take a breath and say, "You're about to get hit from behind." This brought Bond's attention back to Mark. He sneered broadly.
"What sort of pathetic trick is that?"
Then he got hit from behind. He went down from the impact to the nerve cluster on his back. The blow had caught him completely off guard. He started to stand, and a vicious kick from a booted foot snapped his head around, and he barely had time to see the enraged expression of Gower. Bond never got the chance to mount any sort of defense. He was having trouble recovering from the fact that Gower was apparently still alive, that the raiders below had possibly managed to survive, that, in short, everything had gone horribly wrong. This, combined with Gower's assault, left him hammered both physically and mentally. By the time the Brickar slipped into unconsciousness, it was more merciful than anything else. Gower hit him a few more times, even after the Brickar was out cold, for insurance. He looked over to Mac.
"Are you all right?"
he demanded. His voice sounded hoarse. Mark nodded his head. "And you?"
"I have been better,"
admitted Gower. Mark could see the cuts on Gower's throat where Bond had endeavored to strangle him.
Fortunately, Klingon biology is very complicated. We have many internal backup systems that non-Klingons are unaware of. We keep quiet about it. It makes it that much easier to surprise our enemies. We do not die quite that easily.
I'm certainly convinced, said McHenry. Then they heard a whirring noise, and the now familiar sounds of hidden gears grinding. Seconds later, the elevator platform rose, and a dripping wet exploration party came up from below. Worf was in the forefront, Disruptor cradled in his arms. The others had obtained weapons as well from the weapons room. They were prepared for battle, for ambush, for anything except what they saw, namely an unconscious Brickar on the ground, and Gower and Mark in a casual conversation. "Hi, guys," said Mark cheerfully. "Have you signaled for help yet?" They looked at each other.
"No,"
said Worf slowly. "Well, maybe you'd better," Mark told him. "I don't think we want to hang around here forever, do you?" Worf looked at Kalar. She shrugged.
"We will get right on it,"
Worf said. "Good," said Mark McHenry. Chapter 12. Everyone was seated around the conference lounge table. They were looking up expectantly at Captain Taggart, the commander of the Repulse. At that moment, the Repulse, which had picked them up some hours earlier upon receiving their distress call, was on the way to Starbase 3. There they would transfer to the vessel that would take them the rest of the way to Earth, to home, to the Academy. "I hope you folks don't get too upset over this," Taggart began, scratching at his salt and pepper beard. "But it appears that you missed it." Worf frowned, looking at the others. He spoke for all of them when he said,
"Missed what, sir?"
"The so-called Brickar Federation War. There have been some minor skirmishes past few weeks, but the bottom line is that the Grand Alliance the Brickar thought they pulled together, an alliance between various species hostile to the Federation, has more or less fallen completely apart."
"Why am I not surprised?" muttered Zach Keeburn. "I could tell you stories about the fools running our government that make your hair stand on end."
"That may very well be the case, Mr. Keeburn. At any rate, they have been in touch with the Federation about settling differences via peaceful means. Talks are being set up, although they will proceed with caution. The Brickar are claiming, though, that they have things to offer in return for various concessions of rights."
"What things?"
Worf asked. "Captives," said Taggart. "Various innocents who are en route to other destinations and were captured by Brickar ships." The cadets and Klingons looked at each other, and immediately they knew. "The colonists," said Sleeta. "Professor Trump," added Tanya, referring to their injured Starfleet instructor who had left the planet with the others. "That's right," said Taggart. "Our intelligence reports are that everyone is in good health. The Brickar are very much aware of the fact that dead captives will do them no good. We should be able to negotiate for their release with little or no problem. And considering that we have a ton of Brickar weaponry and a prisoner, thanks to you people, we'll have that much more additional leverage when it gets to talk." There was silence for a moment, and then Taggart said, "I want you people to know I am very impressed by the manner in which you handled things planet-side. Very impressed. And my comments and praise are going to be forwarded both to the Academy and to the Klingon Empire. You've acquitted yourselves admirably, and you are to be commended." He spread his hands and said, "I guess that's all. Dismissed." Then a voice came over Taggart's comm badge. "Captain, this is Chafin. The Klingon cruiser As It Bore has dropped out of warp. They say they're here to pick up the Klingon team." "Acknowledged." He turned to the young Klingons and said, "Better get your things and head over to the transporter. Wouldn't want to keep your people waiting." Kalar nodded, and then looked at the Starfleet cadets. It was a moment that called for an impassioned speech, or perhaps a statement of thanks and appreciation for a job well done. "Goodbye," said Kalar. They rose as one and left the room. The cadets looked at one another. Worf sat immobile. There was a great deal he wanted to say to Kalar, but he didn't know quite how to begin, or even if he should. Then he became aware of Tanya watching him carefully, as if reading his mind. Whatever emotions and thoughts were tumbling through her own mind, she chose to keep them private. Instead, she slapped him on the shoulder and said, "Go after her, you fool!" The Klingons were entering the transporter room when Kaler heard a familiar voice shout from behind her. Gower and Kodash paused, already in the open doorway. Kaler gestured for them to go on ahead and then turned to face Worf. He stood there a moment, still uncertain of what to say.
"So, what is your next assignment?"
he said. She looked a bit distant. "I have already applied to be part of the diplomatic team that would oversee the Federation Brickar talks."
"You? A diplomat?"
Her eyes narrowed, but there was amusement in them. "Am I not the soul of diplomacy?"
"You are an elemental force, Kaler. Unstoppable. If diplomacy is what you've decided upon, then I have no doubt that you can force diplomacy down the throat of anyone who disagrees with you."
She laughed, then looking very serious, she said, "Worf, come with us." She raised a questioning eyebrow. "You're not one of them," she pressed on. "You're Klingon. You're one of us. Trying to fit yourself into their world? It is a waste. With them, you'll always be an outsider, but with us..."
"I would be just another Klingon."
"Never," she said flatly. "The Klingon Empire would have much to offer you, and I..." Her voice trailed off for a moment. For a moment, she actually looked shy before she forced the imagined weakness from her and changed her tack. "It is not too late," she said. He sighed deeply, regretfully, but with a sense of conviction.
"I have embarked on a path, Kaler. I must see that path through."
"You have no doubts?"
"I will always have doubts," he said, "but I will always overcome them."
She studied him and then said, "Perhaps you are a genuine Klingon at that." She stepped toward the transporter room, and Worf put a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. She looked at the hand, looked at him, but their worlds were between them.
"Good life to you, Kaler," he said. "Face your foes bravely and die honorably. I suspect we will not meet again."
"Good life to you, Worf," she replied. "Face your foes bravely and die honorably." Then she paused and added with a smile, "And I suspect that you are wrong." She reached into her pack and pulled out a small statue. She handed it to Worf. He recognized it immediately. It was a representation of Kalis the Unforgettable, locked in combat with Morath. "Look at it any time you start to forget who you are." And then she was gone. Worf stayed outside the transporter room, his face immobile, until the whine of the transporter beams had faded completely. Then he walked slowly away, cradling the statue, to seek the company of his fellow cadets from Starfleet Academy.